Welcome, everybody. For the people who are regulars in the class on Tuesday mornings or semi-regulars, it's nice to see you. And for the people who are not regulars and who are joining us this morning, it's exciting to see you too. We're up to 42 screens so far, and people are still coming in. Ben Freed, synagogue intern, is working the back end and letting people in. And if you have any questions about about what's going on, or you're not sure about something, or you want to get my attention about something, I muted you, you can write something in the chat, and you can also unmute yourselves, right? So you can unmute yourselves if you have something that you want to say. So I did a lot of thinking about how to do this class in this format, different than the format that we normally do. So you're going to see it's a little bit of a hybrid. I tried to keep some things similar so that there is a source sheet. There is me. I will have a cup of coffee very soon. So all of those things are the same. What's different is clearly the medium is very different. So we're gonna have to get used to how you unmute yourselves and talk, because I want it to be a participatory class. As I wrote in the chat, we're recording this class. So if you don't want people to hear what you have to say, don't say it. And if you don't want people to see you, then you can close your camera if for whatever reason you don't want people to see. So just wanted to do that caveat. So just as a quick show of hands, I want to know how many people were able. I sent an email last night to some of the people who were on the list, but not the whole synagogue list. How many of you printed out the sources? Raise your hand if you printed out the sources. I see one hand, which is fine. I cut 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Okay, so most of you did not. That's the sense. So I'm going to be sharing a screen. You can choose when I'm sharing my screen to either look at the sources, or if you get bored with the sources, you can actually leave the full screen and you can go back to this, watch the checkerboard and see everybody's face. If you prefer to look at everybody's faces rather than my sources, that is fine. I will never know exactly what you're doing. So we're continuing Parsha stuff. Reading through this week's Parsha with the aim of trying to find something that felt relevant to this year. It did not take long. And I'm going to share the thing that I came up with in just a minute. I've been thinking a lot, as all of us have, about this time and what's different about this time, and what are the constants and what are the things that people are realizing. And this Parsha starts off with a time where people stayed at home. The land laid fallow, which would mean a huge decrease in economic activity, and it was all in the service of a greater good. If it sounds familiar, it's because you read the Parsha and you read all about Shemitah, not because you read the newspaper and you read about the coronavirus. So in the Parsha is a description of the institution of Shemitah, that every 7 years, the economy was supposed to stop, come to a grinding halt. The only thing that you could eat was what got produced naturally from the ground. You couldn't plant anything, right? If a tree gave some apples, you could take the apples, but that was it. And you can imagine that the way the Torah is thinking about this is, in very optimistic ways, right? That when we'll talk about what the purposes were for the whole thing, but it is a stop. And so when I was reading the Parsha, I thought, wow, there's a stop. There's a full stop in the Parsha in life that feels similar. There's a Hebrew term that I want you all to learn really well and repeat several times over the course of this class to yourselves, and that term is lahavdil. Lahavdil means you're making a comparison, but you know that it's not an exact comparison, and you're really saying this is this and that is that, but there's maybe something to learn from the comparison, but it's not an exact comparison. So lahavdil, I'm not saying that this time of coronavirus is like the Shemitah year, not at all. But I do think the notion of doing specific things that are being commanded to us in the service of a greater good that results in lowered economic activity, that all sounds very familiar. So here, I just want to stipulate at the beginning, here are some of the ways, lahavdil, that these two things are very different. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is a useful comparison. So there's many ways that the comparison with coronavirus to Shemitah does not hold. So number one, coronavirus is a disease. It's more like a plague. And Shemitah is a commandment, and it's a commandment that's supposed to be joyous, right? It's supposed to be this year of taking time off and Torah study and depending on the grace of God, right? Like nobody is thinking about that coronavirus as like this great gift. Number two, coronavirus has resulted in tragic death and sickness. And I think, any comparison has to say this, and Shemitah didn't have that element, right? Like that wasn't part of what Shemitah was all about. Coronavirus limits us in many ways besides working the land. And Shemitah was a year in which, besides working the land, we could do all the things that we wanted to do. We could gather, we could have celebrations, we could be with people, we could travel probably further than we normally would have because we weren't tied to our land, right? So that's also a huge, huge difference. But despite those differences, this is where, lahavdil, 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 here's where I think there is a point of comparison. And you'll tell me by the end of class whether you think this comparison works or not. The Torah and later commentators are very concerned with how people reacted to the Shemitah. And how we reacted to this time tells us a lot about who we are as a people and who we are as a society. What was important to them. And I think the same thing is now. That right now, we are creating a story about how we are dealing with this coronavirus. And the question I want to ask us through the prism of Shemitah is, what's the story that we want to be able to tell at the end? And looking at sources around Shemitah, right? Shemitah is intended to create a story, right? And we're going to talk about what that story is. Coronavirus, I don't think is intended to create anything, but there will be a story afterwards. And I guess the question I want to ask us as individuals and as a society is, what is the story that we want to be able to tell when this is over? And I am very hopeful and confident that it will be over and that we'll all be able to be back in class at some point. So with that, I guess I'm going to open it up. If you have any comments about my introduction, I'm happy to take a few comments. Of course, comments need to be short because of the time and because of the medium. But if you have something you want to say, just unmute yourself and jump in. You can raise your hand, but I won't necessarily see everybody. So anybody have anything they want to say about the beginning? Yeah, Terry, unmute yourself. I unmuted you. Okay, Terry.
Okay, you did. All right. Well, first of all, I was wondering if you would somehow tie this together. And as usual, a brilliant job of coming up with something, doing it. And I think one of the main differences is that the Shemitah, it's going to be coming. And there can be some preparing. And you also know when it's going to end. And I think one of the greatest problems with this is uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. So with Shemitah, and there's many sources that talk about how people got ready for Shemitah, right? They had 6 years to prepare for it. And there were many, many things that people did so that they would be ready for Shemitah. Good. Another lahavdil, another way of differentiating them. Anybody else want to say anything? You can either raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and jump in.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Barry.
Oh, okay, so I think your comment about how we react to all of this in the final analysis is really critical. So we can all agree that in terms of what's happening to us, but there may be huge differences in terms of, what we do with it. So frankly, I fluctuate every day between the idea that the glass is half empty versus the glass is half full. I mean, I'm inconsistent about that. But in terms of how the glass is half full, it's a sense of gratitude for what we still have, though it's quite imperfect.
Nice. Okay, good. So I'm going to jump in now. Remember, this class is only an hour, so I'm going to be trying to move a little faster. I found myself creating a source sheet that was for an hour and a half, so we'll see how that works. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. You should all be able to see my screen now. All right. So you should be able to all see the sources, and then you should also be able to see some people off to the right. Like I said, if you don't want to look at my sources, if you'd prefer to look at other people, you just at the top hit the little 9 box thing off to the either the top or to the left of the bar of people. You see like 1 line, a thick line, 2 lines, and 9 little boxes. If you hit the 9 little boxes, you'll see pictures and you won't see my sources. But I worked really hard on my sources, so I hope you look at my sources at least a bit. So for next time, we're gonna talk about like how I can get people to read. But for today, I think I'm just gonna do the reading. So the source that I'm gonna start with is the source from this week's Parsha from Bahar B'chukotai. It talks about one aspect of Shemitah. So this is from the book of Vayikra from Leviticus. And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall keep the land a Sabbath unto the Lord, right? So you come to the land. So remember, we're in the desert still, and we're predicting a time that we're going to be in Israel. And when we get to Israel, you're going to keep the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. So we know what a Sabbath is, right? We just had one a few days ago. We know what Shabbat is. But here, the radical idea is that not only people get Shabbat, but the land gets Shabbat. How does that work? 6 years you shall sow your field. 6 years you put seeds in your field. And
Rabbi,
6 years yeah.
Sorry, 1 sec. Just so everyone knows, we understand that there's a little bit of an issue. The source sheet is just coming through a little bit blurry right now. I don't know if you're having a little bit of internet trouble on your end, but I think it's a little bit better now. So we're going to try to just keep going. But if we have further issues with the source sheet, then we'll try to come up with a fix. But thank you, everyone. We do understand, and we're working on it. Go ahead, Rabbi.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Sometimes I have trouble with my internet. It kind of comes and goes. If I go out for a second, I will re-up. So just stay put. Don't go anyplace. So 6 years you put seeds in your field. 6 years you prune your vineyard and gather the produce. So 6 years everything is normal. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. A Sabbath unto the Lord, right? So Shabbat literally means a resting of solemn rest for the land, a resting to God. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard, right? You can't do any agricultural work. That which grows of itself of your harvest, you shall not reap, and the grapes of your undressed vine you shall not gather. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you and your servant and your maid, and for your hired servants, and for the stranger by your side, that sojourn with you, that live with you, and for your cattle, and for the beasts that are in your land, shall all the increase thereof be for food. So who can summarize what is it saying here? Like, what is this is Vayikra's version of Shemitah, which is different than another one. What is the purpose of Shemitah? Anybody? You're gonna have to just unmute yourself and shout out, because I can't see all of you.
It's a bit like crop rotation.
Yes, explain.
Farmers are told to leave certain parts of their land fallow so that the land could restore itself with minerals and water, so it can be strong again for new planting in the following year.
Exactly. Right. Anybody who's ever planted anything knows that you don't plant the same thing in the same place every year, because certain plants require certain nutrients. You have to move them around, and every once in a while you just have to let your land lay fallow, right? I have a garden in my backyard. Last year I actually declared Shemitah for my summer, because I wasn't going to be home for part of it, and I just let it all lay fallow. I'll let you know how that plays for me this year, because I just planted a bunch of things with some old seeds. So here in Vayikra, Shemitah is about the land, right? And Rabbi Jill Hammer, yeah.
Yeah, for point 6, the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I take it that's how you sustain yourself. Don't you
Exactly.
have to tend to that? Talk about that a little bit. Like what do you grow there to sustain yourself that's different?
You know, if you have an apple tree that you planted last year and it produces some apples, you can eat those. But that's all. That's like, it's just what naturally comes up from the land, right? So like in my garden, that sometimes tomato plants come up from the compost, just because the compost didn't get hot enough. So if I get lucky and there's a tomato plant, then I get a tomato. But it's really what it is. And mostly you have to save stuff up, right? You have to,
Okay.
you know, yeah. So
do I work during this whole year? Do I work?
No, you are off. If you're a farmer, you are off. The farmer.
If you're a businessman,
what?
If you're a businessman, you don't work, I take it. Of course, you're dealing with an agricultural society, but
Exactly. Right. So most people are farmers, Yeah, everyone is off. And Rabbi Jill Hammer at the bottom, she just kind of summarizes Vayikra's perspective on Shemitah. Shemitah is a reminder that letting the earth be free of our control is good for us, and it is what God wants. Wild spaces are a delight for God. We need them, and they may save our lives. I love that. I love the way she put it, right? Wild spaces are a delight for God. Every 7 years, we just let the land go back. And again, like, the way my mind works, right? You've all seen the videos of the dolphins that are suddenly swimming in places that they haven't been swimming. I feel, maybe it's because I'm home all the time, but I feel like there's so many more birds around my house than there were in the past few years, right? Like the way nature is just kind of asserting itself at this time when we have pulled back. And Rabbi Jill Hammer summarizes. So Vayikra's perspective on Shemitah is, it is about the earth. Notice a lovely graphic. And now look at a different perspective on Shemitah. So this is from the book of Shemot. This is from the book of Exodus. And here, pay attention. What is the key word here that differentiates Exodus's focus from Vayikra? And 6 years you shall sow your land and gather the increase thereof, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of thy people may eat, and what they leave, the beast of the field shall eat. In like manner you shall deal with thy vineyard and your olive groves. So the key difference here from the first one is it's the same laying fallow, right? The land doesn't get work, but what's the purpose here? Somebody want to unmute yourself and tell me what the purpose here, as opposed to the first one, which is focused on the land? Anybody?
It's to allow the poor to eat.
To allow the poor to eat. Thank you, Michael. Different focus, right? The first one is an environmental focus, a focus on the economics of farming. How do you make sure that your fields are productive for a long time, right? You let them rest. And it's about society pulling back from economic growth, right? Everybody kind of falls back to a more basic level of living. It's not like anybody has more or less stuff to eat in that year from what they grow, right? Everybody's on the same footing. Here, this is about a sociological issue. This is the socio-economic part of things, that the poor may eat, right? Everybody is the same. So the first one is just really about the land, just to be more careful about how I said it. The second one is about people. And Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, the emphasis here is clear, helping the individual, not simply as an act of loving kindness, one person reaching out to his friends, but rather on the level of a general society, in that a situation of equality has been created. There are no givers and no receivers, no rich and no poor. All soil, all produce are hefker, ownerless. Workers and employers are all cut off, and the poor of your nation shall eat. The social reform, the striving for equality, connect to the monetary Shemitah in which debts are forgiven, as if all return to the starting point and begin anew.
Isn't it,
Yes, Howard?
isn't the difference really between the two portions is one deals with your physical well-being, the second one deals with your emotional and religious well-being? What is expected of you?
Tell me more about how you see those two things.
I think the Shemitah really has to deal, at least according to Exodus, has to deal with preparing yourself physically for a year when you can't harvest your grain, your crop, to make sure that you have physical things around you to make your life pleasant, or at least not die, whatever. Really, it really has to do with their mental state, their well-being. It's almost like saying it may lead immediately, but on the second hand, it fish for Mali. That really, you really are really trying to get these people mentally into the spirit of it is giving it away when you don't need it.
Nice, right? So one way of thinking about it is the way that Howard just talked about it. Another way of thinking about it, just going back up to Vayikra, Vayikra is saying that when you have pulled back from this agricultural work, suddenly you start to realize things about the world, right? Jill Hammer said it. uh, the letting the earth be free of our control is good for us. Why do you think letting the earth be free of our control is good for us? I think that part of the answer here is that it's about the land, but it's also, as Howard said, it's also about us. It's how we relate to things, how we relate to stuff. And again, to make this comparison between what the experience of coronavirus has been like for people, like suddenly we are recognizing and realizing what it's like to not have easy access to stuff. I mean, thank God we have homes, we have food, right? We have people worrying about people who are, having trouble getting food or can't afford food. But like, what is it like as a society in this time when we've all pulled back, right? And are we in this time, again, not of anybody's choosing, but are we learning the lesson that we need to learn, that we don't control everything? Like we don't control the land, and we don't control diseases. And somebody said the other day, when you get into a fight with Mother Nature wins. Mm-hmm. But someone else told me yesterday, someone at the synagogue, Bob Schwartz, said a great line. He said, Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. Like, you don't want to stop. You want to keep going because you want to get to the other side, right? And so, but like, how is this time moving people, some people, to recognize what control is all about, right? And how that in some ways is great for us in our world, but some ways it's actually not so good for us in our world. And in the Shemot version, what kind of society are we? Right? I mean, we read the newspapers and we see that this disease is hitting people in different socioeconomic categories in very different ways. It's hitting people in different age categories in very different ways. And are we a society that cares about, I'll substitute the word poor, but everybody, right? Like everybody who in this particular instance is a little bit, at a disadvantage. So I think if the first one is about like internal thinking about like, what is my relationship to stuff? And the second one is, what is my relationship to other people? And what kind of society are we trying to create? Right? Like one of the things that I just been really moved, it's a silly thing, but like every time I'm at a meeting of the leadership of our synagogue and people talk about how like really trying hard to make sure that like all the employees of the synagogue, our part-time custodians are still being paid by the synagogue right now. And so like that's an incredible value statement of like, we're trying to get through this together, right? And like at the end of this, what are we going to be able to say about how as a society we reacted? In some ways, right, we're going to be able to say, wow, we shut down the whole country because of vulnerable populations, but we know that there's pushes and pulls and tugs, and there's the socioeconomic thing. And so like the other question I think that Shemitah asks us to consider is what kind of society are we during the other 6 years, right? 1 year we have this perspective. What kind of society are we in the other 6 years? So that's two ways I think of comparison. One, that internal way of comparison. The second, like how we relate to other people. There's another piece of this in that even in the Bible, they recognized that Shemitah was very, very hard, right? This is a mitzvah that when the rabbis talk about it, you'll see in a second, they say this is like the hardest mitzvah in the world. But even back in the Torah, they say, and if you shall say, what shall we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we may not sow nor gather our increase, right? Like that is people saying, this is hard. Like, how can you expect me to live without my produce? The Torah already has an answer. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth produce for the 3 years. So here's the miracle that the Torah promises, that in the 6th year, you're going to get your crop is going to be a bumper crop. You're going to have 3 years worth of food. And so you'll have for the 7th year, and then for the next year when you're sort of ramping up again, right? And you shall sow in the 8th year and eat the produce, the old store until the 9th, until her produce come in, you shall eat the old store. So what's interesting to me about that source is that perspective on something that feels very hard, and people are pushing back and saying, I can't do this. right? And I think everybody on this call, I know for me, there have been moments where I thought like, this is impossible. Like, how can anyone expect us to do this, right? One of the great things I read at the beginning is like, it was the very beginning of this. I don't know that I would think it's so funny right now, but you know, it was something that said, you know, our forefathers, you know, our grandparents, you know, when faced with wars, were asked to go off to wars, and we're being asked to sit on our sofas, right? Like, there is a difference, right, to what we're being asked at this time, but it's hard. It's really hard, and I think that, you know, people have moments where they think like, this is really impossible. And now, if you go to Vayikra Rabbah, the Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, this is the very first series of Midrashim. The rabbis talk about the book of Vayikra, and here's what they say. So they're quoting a verse from Psalms, the mighty and strength that fulfill God's word, right? Giburei koach oseh dvaro. To whom does the scripture refer? So what is the book of Psalms talking about? Who is the mighty in strength that fulfill God's word? Rabbi Isaac said, to those who are willing to observe the year of release, the Shemitah year. Because it's the way of the world that a man may be willing, or woman may be willing, to observe a commandment for a day, a week, a month. But is he or she likely to continue to do so through the remaining days of the year? But throughout that year, this mighty man sees his field declares ownerless, or field declared ownerless, his or her fence is broken down, and his or her produce consumed by others, and yet they continue to give up their produce without saying a word. Can you conceive of a person mightier than such as he or she? This midrash blew me away. The rabbis get it. Okay, you want me to do a commandment for a day. You want me to observe Shabbat. I'm in. You want me to do a week, Pesach, Sukkot. Okay, a month. The month of Elul, I'll try to do tshuva. You want me to do a mitzvah for a year? That's crazy. I don't want you to raise your hand, but how many of you have thought over the course of the last several months, this is crazy? A day, fine. A week, a month, fine. Right? But like longer than that? And I think that that's another area. I'm going to take questions in a second. I think that's another area where the comparison feels, not the comparison of what the thing is, but how we're reacting to it feels very similar. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. And I want to take some comments because I spoke a lot just now. All right. Yeah, so sorry about the fuzziness if it's coming and going, but hopefully you could hear me and I wasn't so fuzzy. So I want to hear some comments or questions about the stuff I've presented so far. You know, the idea of
Wasn't
Shemitah
there also I wouldn't say, I don't know if it's in the Bible, but during the 7 years prior to the, or 6 years prior to the Shemitah, you were supposed to store food away.
Yeah.
So you have this year.
Correct. Yeah, you were supposed to store food away. And in Vayikra, they say, and not only that, but you'll have plenty of food that'll be produced in the 6th year, so you'll
Correct.
be able to store it away. Yeah, Evelyn.
Absolutely, yes.
Evelyn, unmute yourself. I thought you raised your hand. Evelyn, I'm trying to unmute you. No, okay. Okay, so I'm just noticing that it's the men who are speaking. I want to hear some of the women speaking. So I'm looking for a woman raising her hand. I see some more men raising their hands. Yes.
Okay.
Even though it says Stephen Grinnell, it is not Stephen Grinnell. It is Robin Grinnell.
Okay.
So I'm going to take you.
Robinson.
Robin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Robin. Oh, sorry. Okay.
She's muted.
Yeah, good.
How about
Okay.
that?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Well, you know, I'm at a point in life where I take care of myself. Stephen and I take care of ourselves. I thought, what if I had young children in the house? This would be chaos here. I would have to be doing schoolwork. I would have to be on call all day, every day. I would be feeling completely different. Where's my washing machine? Where's the dishwasher? Yes, this would be a completely other situation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, right, different people experience this differently, and as Robin said, if she had young kids at home, right, that would be a very different experience than just like needing to take care of yourself and maybe one or two other people in the house, right? Very, very different experiences. Who else has something that they want to say? You can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can unmute yourself and jump in.
Rabbi,
Yes.
there was reference by Rabbi Lichtenstein twice on monetary Shemitah. Can you
Thank you. Yeah.
tell us a
So
little more about that and how
Right.
some members of the community get around that?
Yeah, so there's a third, so Shemitah had three things of it. One was the land thing that we talked about. The other is that there were things connected to debts that happened every 7 years and also after every 49 years, but more after every 7 years, debts were forgiven. And so people were always working on 7-year cycles in terms of their debts. That's in the book of Dvarim. So that's the monetary Shemitah. And then at the end of 49 years, slaves were let go. So I'm sorry, at the end of 7 years, there was also slaves who were also let go. So so those are the other two elements that I'm not focusing on so much today.
The most important element is expectation. Clearly, they know what's going to happen in the 7th year, whether they choose to get themselves organized and ready to live this way off, not off the land.
Exactly. So, as Howard said, there was an expectation of the Shemitah that's very different than our experience right now. Ed, you've had your hand up.
I read some years ago about Israel nowadays. Shemitah is observed by many farmers, kibbutzim, agricultural folks, and they buy their goods from the Palestinians during that year, the crops, which give them some business, obviously.
Right.
But
so there's
Shemitah applies, I think, only in Eretz Israel, no?
Correct. So Shemitah is only in Israel. My garden. Israel and my garden, the two places where Shemitah is observed. So that's another interesting thing about how Shemitah is observed these days, in that mostly it's not observed. Because it's so hard, like jumping off that last source, most Israeli farmers rely on a legal fiction where they actually sell their fields to a non-Jew, sort of like Pesach, and then they work their fields during those years because it was felt when the Zionists came back to Israel, it was felt that observing Shemitah in its fullness would mean economic collapse for the country. There are some farms that are very careful about observing it, and people give them charity to help them out, and they have big signs on their field saying this field observes Shemitah, and they try to figure it out. But most religious farmers, and for sure not religious farmers in Israel, do not observe Shemitah, which I think goes back to the other thing, which is who would pick to do something like this, right? In any of the things that we're talking about today, right? Like nobody would choose to do Shemitah. And in fact, when they could, the rabbis actually came up with a way around it, which is also really interesting. All right, any last comment before I share something different?
One thing we neglected.
I say something?
Rabbi, you mentioned something about apples and trees. I planted trees in my garden in the country, and I had a Chabadnik friend's son come by a few years ago, and the first question he asked me is, when did the trees first bear fruit? And he told me something I don't quite understand. I either embarrassed, didn't have time to ask him to explain.
Yeah, so there's something called Urla, which is that after, you're not supposed to eat from a fruit tree until 3 years have passed. And at the end of 3 years, you bring the first fruits to the temple, and then you can eat it. And some people observe it even outside of Israel. They don't eat the fruit for the first 3 years. That's probably what he's asking about.
Thank you.
What do we do with the temple sacrifices?
So I'm just curious though, like so far, like what, if anything, is resonating or not resonating for you about the notion of Shemitah as being a test for individuals about how they're going to deal with like not having their stuff and not having income in the same way. It's a test for society about how they're going to take care of each other. And it's really hard, and how that does or doesn't map on to what we're doing, what we're going through right now. I'm just curious, is that resonating? Not so much?
Rabbi Katz, you
Yeah,
mentioned
Ben.
you mentioned that one of the things that this puts us in touch with, both Shemitah and the virus crisis, is that there's certain things we don't have control over. And the amount of control that we have, whatever is left, there are major differences between people based on class and one's financial situation. So one of the silver linings of this, perhaps, is the development of empathy for those in our society who have less, with the prayer that once the crisis is over, we'll be able to sustain that perspective and really help do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that all the time, right? Like, when will the empathy run out? Like, it feels like it feels like people in society, maybe not politicians, but I feel like people in society are feeling the empathy a lot, and trying to be supportive and all of that stuff. And I think a lot of politicians are feeling that. But I wonder if it's going to run out. Right? Like, at what point will people turn mean and, sort of, I need it for me and all that stuff? Yes, I think that is a big question, that I also think about Shemitah. Like, how did it really work? Like, were people really so happy? Were big landowners happy to say, sure, come harvest from my fields this year, right? Like, was that such an easy thing to do? Other people, about whether the comparison is working for you, not working for you, other things you're hearing in this?
I think that it's definitely working. Going back to Rabbi Lichtenstein, the situation of equality, social reform, striving for equality, which certainly is a part of it, these essential workers. And, they're essential now, but basically they're not treated well at all, and resources don't go into them even today. And in the Midrash Leviticus, how his field is ownerless, the fences are broken down. And I think in some ways it's almost like God saying, there but for fortune go you and I, and this is how it feels for other people.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
also peer pressure might have some effect on it, because with the billions that were given to like the Lakers and to Howard, and people were shamed into returning a lot of that money because it was supposed to help small business. But I don't know how optimistic I am about a full societal change, but it really is time, and it would be nice.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see politically, like, what this changes about, how people vote and what they think about, different, all these things that we've been talking about for years, like what healthcare is like in our country and what education is like in our country, right? Like, is this going to be the catalyst that sort of crystallizes that things for people and moves them for a different place? Or are people going to be like, oh, thank God it's over, we can go back to our regularly scheduled programming? I think that's a really big question. So I want to go back to sharing my screen, but to share something a little different. So I'm actually going to share a video, and I will tell you about the video in a second. All right. Okay, so this is a video. It's by an Israeli artist named Kobi Oz. Kobi Oz grew up in Sderot, in a Tunisian family in Israel. And he was part of, he still is part of a band called Tipex. And it was this band, it was really interesting because it was all of these young people from what in Israel is called the periphery, right? Like, not Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, but these outer ring cities that were mostly poor, mostly immigrants, children of immigrants, mostly Sephardic, Russian, Ethiopian. And there was, a great deal of poverty in those communities. And so, and there was this time when all of these, Sderot and a couple other cities, like, there were all these artists that started singing songs that integrated their own cultural heritage with, kind of more, Western music. So Kobe Oz wrote a song called Zalman. And the story in the song is all about Zalman, who thinks he's like in charge of the world, who feels like he's in control of things, who feels like he owns everything from his land to his wife to his children, can control everything. And Kobe Oz in the song argues that Shemitah is one of the ways that Zalman is meant to realize his place in the world. So I want to share the song, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
זלמן הסתובב בעולם מבולבל, שאל את עצמו מי אני ובכלל. אני חקלאי, יש לי שטח גדול, ואני מנהל את הכל. אני מגדל פירות וירקות, מקפיד לדשן, לעבד, להשקות. אני המושל על חלקת אדמה, ואז יצאה בת קול ואמרה, זלמן זה לא אתה, הנה תראה שנת שמיטה, השדה מלבלב לי עזרתך, אתה לא אדמתך. אתה פשוט, זלמן התקשר לכאן ולכאן, אמר לעצמו אני הבוס של הזמן, אני רק מרים איזה טלפון קטן ומיד מסודר העניין. יש לי מעמד מסביב לשעון, קריירה נונסטופ, מניות וממון, אני תמיד זמין לכל הפתעה, והופ יצאה בת קול ואמרה, זלמן זה לא אתה, הנה שבת המלכה, עכשיו תהיה במנוחה, אתה אחד מהעם שאומר תפילה, מעמדך לא אתה, אדמתך לא אתה, אתה פשוט זלמן.
All right.
Nice.
Okay.
That was fabulous. Now you've
Yeah.
added something new. You've never done videos and music when we're in class. Congratulations.
Everyone's learning new skills. Everyone's learning new skills. If Shoshi would learn how to cut my hair, the world would be perfect. So, so that song, I didn't know the song before, but I found it as I was thinking about Shemitah. And the song is really interesting, right? Because it says there's this guy, Zalman, who thinks, who am I and what am I for? Kind of quoting what Howard said before, right? Who am I in the world? Like, who am I and what am I all about? Says Zalman, oh, I'm a farmer. I grow things. Oh, Shemitah comes along and says, no, you don't grow things, right? That's not who you are, right? Because you can't grow things for this year. Oh, who am I? I'm the boss of my time. I'm in control of everything. God says, oh, right, Zalman, there's this thing called Shabbat. You're not actually the boss of your time. And the song goes on and talks about all of the ways that Zalman is actually not in charge of his world in the way he thought he was. Zalman also thinks of him in Hebrew, the word husband literally means owner. Baal means owner. And so, it plays with that. And he's, Zalman's like, well, I have a wife and she's beautiful and she's mine. And then the singer says, no, your wife isn't yours, actually, right? There are times of the month that you are separate, and it's to remind you that she's not your property. That's not what this is all about. That's not what any of that is about. And it goes through all these commandments and makes the argument that the commandments are supposed to remind us that we are none of those things. We are not our jobs. We are not the time, our status. We're not who our partner is. We're not any of that. Like, we are Zalman. We're just ourselves, right? We are just ourselves. And I think that's another, powerful connection for me. I think there's a lot of people who are kind of in this stripped down world, just, realizing who they are and what they're really all about, and who are the people who are really important to me. Like, those are the people that I'm calling right now. Like, who are the people what are the things I'm really spending my time on? I'm spending my time on this, right? I'm spending my time on, on the show. Like, that's clearly the thing that's most important, and that's of my essence. Yeah, Debbie.
Sort of tangentially, I saw a segment on TV about all these diseases, SARS and swine flu, and I don't know, all these other things that the guy's comment was, the way we treat animals and the way we giant agri farms, no wonder, we try to corral them and we try to get as much as we can from them. We throw antibiotics at the problem. And, what do we think is going to happen? And a lot of these diseases, including this one, he was purporting comes from maybe the way that we conduct ourselves vis-a-vis the agriculture. And I think you could apply it to this too. We want to get the most out of the land, and we want to control, and we want. And maybe God knew better and said, that's not going to be productive in the end, and you have to respect the earth, and you have to give it a chance to replenish and grow. And
yeah, for sure. I think that's another side of it, right? Like how we treat the earth, how we treat animals, and nature wins. Nature, or hopefully doesn't win, but nature puts up a really good fight.
Here we are.
And here we are, right? Yeah, Amy.
Yeah, I just want to say two quick things. One is that this whole idea of we are not those things, like we're not our job, it's a really interesting question to me, because as I started thinking about retirement, that was one of the things I started thinking about a lot was, if I'm not going to work every day, then who am I? Because I've defined myself so much over the years by the work that I do, which is still important to me. And the other thing I want to say that on the flip side of that is, we're not those things, but in a sense we are those things. And it's this feeling that I've always had that we're put here with these guidances, that if you're a person of faith and you believe that God has laid out these guidances for us in the form of what should be rules that we follow, but it's our responsibility to implement those and to follow those as they will best serve the world. So it may not, so to say that we're not those things, if I'm a farmer or I'm a frontline healthcare worker, that's not who we are, but that is who we are, and that we need to find a way to put all those pieces together.
Yeah, I love that. Suzanne?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind that I imagine did not happen during the Shemitah year was isolation. And I personally feel that this teaching me that I need to reach out more to people who are perhaps isolated because their world is really very small right now, despite the computer, despite TV, that personal touch. And I have experienced it this past 2 weeks, how important the personal touches.
Incredibly beautifully said. I don't know if you remember, but a couple weeks before, when was Sister Shabbat? In January, maybe? So in January, Shirley Bender spoke in Shabbat and Shul, and then we also published her thing in the last Synagogue. And she talked about loneliness, and she talked about, how hard it was. And this was before any of this happened. And I think, Suzanne, your that perspective is so important, right? Like that wasn't a feature of Shemitah. It wasn't that, kind of alienation from other people, but it for sure is a feature of this, that that's powerful to have that recognition. Irene?
I really feel that where we are today is not where we're going to be tomorrow, certainly in the fall. I think what's happening outside is going to get worse. But what has happened and will continue to happen is redefinition of our lives. There's the isolation. There are also the formation. We're very lucky because we had a community that we could restructure, but there's a new sense of what family is.
Uh-huh.
People who were working out of the home are now home with their children, so families have reconnected. It's going to change, as the Times said today, dramatically what a city looks like, what work looks like, what sharing looks like. And I think what I wrestle with is where I am in this moment and how do I create a life as Shemitah, you would plan for it, but how do I plan not just for the next week and how we're eating and how we're connecting to our little family, but how do I sustain a life like this? Because I think we're going to have to for a long time, and the text sort of guides us to some clarity of you have to think ahead. But we're busy thinking about today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next August.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
exactly
thank you.
is going to happen?
Thank you. So I'm actually gonna use my powers of muting to mute everybody, and just so that I can to finish up, because this class is only an hour, not my normal hour and a half. So yeah, I really appreciate what people said. And before I read the last source, I meant to do this at the beginning of class and I forgot. I'm sorry. I wanted to actually dedicate this class to Ben Fruchter, who passed away 2 weeks ago, Suzanne's husband, and to dedicate this learning in his memory. And Ben, was a part of the class for a while, and also to Jerry Ornstein, who was a dear member of the synagogue who passed away this past week. Unfortunately, there have been several deaths in the congregation, many deaths in the congregation in the last month and a half. And one of the ways to remember people is by learning in their honor and memory. So I want to dedicate this to them and to everybody else who's passed away. I want to end with one source, and then suggest that you can download the source sheet. I just posted it in the chat. You can click on it and save it to your computer, and then you can print it out. You can have the sources. So this is a source by Rabbi David Ingber, who's a rabbi at Romamu in the city. And he's talking about Shemitah, and he's talking, I would say, a little bit to kind of enthrall of the idea of Shemitah to really map onto coronavirus for me, honestly. But I think it's really interesting, and I think that there is something to think about. He writes, I'll share the screen so you can see it. Okay. Something miraculous happens when we stop. We get to experience the power that nature knows, called dormancy. Dormancy, that which is holding, the heartbeat that rests, the hibernating animals all of winter waiting and waiting. There are seeds inside each and every one of us, inside this culture that cannot emerge because we do not know that dormancy does not mean death. Resting does not mean disappearing. What keeps us from stopping is that we are terrified of resting. We are afraid of the imaginative, terrible things we will feel in the quiet. We fear that when we stop even for a moment, the sheer enormity of our lives will overwhelm us. Our spoken and unspoken fears, they speed up our lives. Like a stone being thrown over a lake, we learn to skip so that we don't get too wet, and we're terrified if we let the stone fall, we will disappear. And so we think that our speed will save us from the void. We dance around the security that is offered from touching what is underneath the speed. Can we let go of the obsession of finishing that which cannot be finished? So I think that was actually a beautiful meditation on Shemitah. I think it could be some of our experiences during this coronavirus, right? Again, the part of the comparison that doesn't work is that there's something awful about the coronavirus and the people are getting sick and people are dying. And that's not at all what Shemitah was all about. But the effect on our society is in some ways very similar. And I think that we're going to be asked at the end of all of this, what's the story that we told about ourselves during this time? Did we recognize during this time, what this earth of ours demands? Did we recognize during this time what it means to be in society with other people who have and have less and have different than us? will we recognize what's inside of us and who we really ultimately are? Are those going to be the stories and the lessons that we take out of this? Or are we going to shrug our shoulders when it's all over and say, okay, glad that was over, going back to regularly scheduled programming? And I think it's a real big question. The last source in the packet is Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin. I don't know why they didn't call her rabbi. I cut and pasted it, but she's a rabbi also. And she has a beautiful piece just about the story of Shemitah and that what's the story that we tell. And so I encourage you to think as we head into Shabbat, what is the story that you could imagine a culture would have wanted to tell at the end of Shemitah? And what is the story that we're going to want to tell as a culture and as individuals as we head hopefully into a better time at the end of all of this, and as we move into different iterations. So I want to wish everyone a good week. It's Wednesday, so I can already say Shabbat Shalom to everybody. It's really nice seeing you. The way we're going to work this is Rabbi Greenberg and I are going to switch off teaching, and so she's going to be teaching next week, and so you get to hear different voices of Torah, and this was really fun. I have to say, I want to thank all of the people who wrote saying, gee, Rabbi, we really missed the Tuesday morning class. I really appreciated the encouragement to kind of make time to do this. It's hard to figure out, a little bit like what comes first, but I'm glad that we got to this. And if you have other ideas about other ways for the synagogue to create communities for people who already know each other and also to bring people into community, please let us know. So have a good week. Thank you all for coming. If you want to download the sources, like I said, you can just click on them. They're a little bit up on the in the chat. And maybe one of the weeks I can divide you into small groups to discuss things. But I decided training wheels this week. A song and a source sheet was plenty of excitement on the video. All right. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, you can unmute yourselves. If you want to chat, you can chat as long as you like, but class is officially over.
Hi, Sheila.
Boker Tov.
Sure. Hi. Glad you're there.
Shirley, I didn't see you. So good to see. I didn't realize you were on the call.
It's so good seeing everybody's faces scattered as you are. Scattered geographically.
Who's bringing snack next week? Terry, you're on that, okay?
I had to eat a lot of the things that I had bought because they would have expired.
It's like Shemitah in your house. You had all this snack food that you've been able to eat through this time.
I must say what I was going through withdrawal. I missed the class so much, and I thought this was wonderful. And everybody who's involved in getting this together.
Thanks. And thank you, Ben Fried, who was kind of in the background making things work.
Thank you, Ben.
It's wonderful to see everybody. It's heartwarming. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who has reached out, because without you, I'm not sure what my isolated time it would have been. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. And my son thanks you for being there.
Good. 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 All right. I'm going to sign off. Everybody, like I said, you can chat for a little while longer, but I'm going to sign off. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great.
Can I see Vivian? I'm gonna call her on the phone.
Shirley. No, she's.
Oh, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
That's Evelyn.
Yes, Evelyn.
Evelyn.
You can hear me?
We can hear you, Evelyn.
Oh, great. So, I've been on a number of Zoom. Frankly, I'm sick of Zoom. But it's the only way to communicate with people. I hate this. I just hate it. I want to be with people and be close to them I don't want to be with my iPad. So I wasn't sure. I wanted to say a number of things for class, but I wasn't sure. Next time I unmute myself, people hear me. Is that how it's done?
Evelyn, you're fading in and out. Are you near your microphone? Go closer to your microphone and let's see if we can hear you.
Her microphone is muted now. She muted it. Shirley, can you hear me? Unmute your microphone. You got a very nice shout out from, the rabbi gave you a very nice shout out about your, I don't know if you wrote it, about your speech at Sisterhood Shabbat.
Right. Thank you. It was, he didn't know I was on the Zoom.
You see? So he wasn't trying to curry favor.
That's right. I didn't expect that. But be well. Thank you. It was so good being here. What a good class. And it really makes you feel good just to be with everyone.
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Cherry, and everybody in the group. I'm leaving. Okay? Bye-bye.
Bye.
Debbie, I come in. We can't see you. We know you're there.
Barry, what happened? Barry, did Ellen leave?
Ellen left for Venezuela.
Hi, Marion.
I don't know. I lost track of her. But what I wanted to say is that the irony of the virus is obviously we have to keep distance from each other. And and what we need most, frankly, at times like this, is to be physically close to each other. And though this Zooming, takes care of that in some small way, it's just not the same.
No, absolutely. And I completely identify and feel so bad for Sue, because it's hard enough to lose a husband, but then to be isolated in it. Because
Right.
I know that when Freddie died, the comfort I got from everyone and the shiva and everything was so important and still is.
Yes, I also know a couple of people who unfortunately have lost loved ones, not to the virus, but just, the natural course of getting old during this time. And
Yes.
I just can't imagine the tandem of that kind of loss and the kind of the more generic kind of loss of space and the rest of it that we're experiencing because of the virus. It seems like, I think I would be totally overwhelmed by that combination.
It's very hard. It's very, very hard. Barry, just like class, we talk afterwards, right? This is just like regular class.
Okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, right?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yes.
I also, just one question that I don't think, I think one of the questions that gets generated by these two parshas is questions of entitlement. What exactly are we entitled to in this life? Nobody ever promised me or anybody else a rose garden. And I think it's a real test of character. I mean, it's tragic that, this is the way character's somehow tested, but I think it's a real test of character about how, people individually deal with this. And obviously some people have an easier go of it because of their situation. So for example, my daughter is a clinical psychologist, and it just so happens that about half of her private caseload, which I guess amounts to about a dozen patients overall, half of it, are people on the front lines. medical people on the front lines.
Right.
And whatever we're experiencing, and what we're experiencing can be pretty horrific, what they're experiencing is beyond the pale. There's almost no way of describing it.
No, it's very, very true. And even when Amy was talking about, when they read the poem Zalman, and then what are you going to do and who are you, and with her retirement, I think the difference is, though, that Zalman was arrogant and felt that he was, entitled to these things, where I don't think, from what I know of Amy through the years, she's not like that. But it is this sense of arrogance. And even when I talk to some friends and, yeah, you complain, but one of them had some complaint and laughed and said, well, yeah, this is like a real first world white person problem. And that's what so much of it is. But I do find that when I think about some of this, I mean, can you imagine like going through the Holocaust or going through like certain things? What was that like? And I read about this one woman whose family was in hiding. She was like 5 years old, and they were basically like someone like dug like a pit for them somewhere, and they were there for about 2 years, and they survived. Yes. They couldn't talk. They couldn't do this. When she came out, she had to learn how to walk again. So I think that, a lot of us today are really quite spoiled. And not that, I don't wish that everyone go down to a lowest common denominator. It would be nicer if everyone could rise up to a better quality of life.
Yeah, I think you're saying it really helps give you a perspective about your own plight in this. But I would also say at the same time, I don't think you should go too far along that extreme part of the continuum. Yes, others have it far worse, but that's not to mitigate the fact that even those of us who are rather lucky in terms of the population.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree. And I understand and I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, our plight is real too. So I'm going to go find my wife, everyone.
Okay, say hello for me. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Now, how do we get out of this?
That's always the question. It's sometimes very easy to enter a space, but to get out of that space?
Oh, on the bottom, it says leave meeting on the lower right in red.
Lower right. Oh, leave. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.